Hello and welcome to this session of Kirloskar Vasundhara Film Festival. I hope you're safe, healthy, and at home. In school, we have learned that every life form has a natural predator. In any landscape, diverse communities coexist, and the prey predator relationship keeps a check on the population. It is therefore critically important to conserve biological diversity in any ecosystem and retain the physical forms in their natural elements. Biodiversity is important not just for nature but also for human health, as several researches and studies have established the association between thriving biodiversity and human health. In a healthy ecosystem, viruses, bacteria, and other microbes are constrained geographically and seasonally by the ecosystem regulatory functions. However, when an ecosystem degrades and biodiversity is lost, species composition changes, and non native plantations invade the landscape, then we have these viruses and bacteria escape from their natural habitats and enter human systems. In the last few decades, we have seen a host of new epidemics come. Rabies, Japanese encephalitis, KYASANUR forest disease, and the latest COVID-19 pandemic are all examples of what are termed as zoonotic diseases. Today, we shall discuss this very important and relevant topic of zoonotic diseases. We have two experts with us who will help us understand what are zoonoses, what are the reasons for this frequent occurrence of these zoonotic diseases, and what could be some of the measures to control the diseases. So, without much ado, let's walk into the studio.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session. We have a very interesting session lined up today, and one that really goes with these pandemic times about zoonotic diseases. I'd like to introduce you to our speakers for today who have been working in the field of disease ecology for the past several years. Dr. Beth Pearce is an ecologist and senior scientist at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. She currently leads three interdisciplinary One Health projects on neglected zoonotic diseases in India, including the Monkey Fever Risk Project that investigates the social and ecological risk factors for emergence of a tick-borne human disease, the KYASANUR forest disease, in forest-dependent communities in the Western Ghats. Dr. Abhivanak is a senior fellow at A3 Bangalore and a fellow of the DBT Wellcome Trust India Alliance program. An ecologist by training, Dr. Vanak's current work uses the One Health framework to examine the dynamics of rabies in multi host systems and the factors contributing to the risk of vector borne diseases in socio ecological systems in India. He is the lead author of the One Health and Zoonosis program of India's proposed National Mission on Biodiversity and Human Well-being. A very warm welcome to both of you, and thank you for being here today. With the COVID-19 pandemic, we've increasingly seen the term zoonotic diseases being used in the media. So, Beth, starting with the basics first, what are zoonotic diseases or emerging zoonotic diseases?
Zoonotic diseases are infectious diseases that are transmitted between vertebrate animals and people, so things like livestock and wildlife hosts. And they can be transmitted in different ways. So they might be transmitted directly through, say, saliva or excretions of the host, or there might be something like a insect or tick vector involved in transmission. So normally animals live in they sort of co-evolve with their viruses, and maybe the viruses live quite happily inside the animals, but the problems tend to come when viruses get into new hosts. So it's really where viruses have got into humans from animals that the problems start to occur. And then emerging diseases tend to be those that have increased in incidence a lot in the last couple of decades, or they might have spread quite widely across into new geographies. So that's sort of an emerging disease event.
Abhi, would you like to add anything here?
Humans have been hosts for zoonosis for a very long, as long as we've lived with animals or in any natural environment. We've been exposed to some form of zoonosis or the other, including, one of the oldest known zoonoses in the world is rabies, and we've known rabies for a fairly long period of time.
So could you elaborate about how this disease is still affecting India?
So rabies, is a comes from a group of viruses called the Lissa virus family genus, and there's a whole range of Lissa viruses that can create rabies-like symptoms. The one that we most commonly know or know quite well is, of course, the rabies virus. Now, the rabies virus can affect any warm-blooded animal. So, in fact, there's also been a record of a chicken getting rabies. Um, in India, domestic dogs are the main reservoir for rabies, or the main host for rabies. And most cases in India, more than 95% of cases in humans of rabies is caused by the bite of a domestic dog. We also, of course, have a very large population of domestic dogs, which is why India has the dubious distinction of having the highest number of rabies cases in the world. So we have estimates, or guesstimates are at approximately 20,000 human deaths per year. So this is a third of all rabies cases worldwide. And this is estimated to come from one of about 20 million dog bites that people in India suffer from. So this is the reason that rabies is still quite prevalent in India. We haven't been able to successfully control it because of a variety of factors, but most importantly because of poor pet ownership rules and a failure to control the large free-ranging dog population in India.
That makes me wonder about the human wildlife or human animal interface, like the example of rabies, which occurs in humans because of their interaction with dogs or other domesticated animals. And I think our audience might be wondering about the implications of an increased human wildlife interface in the face of the rampant biodiversity loss that has been happening across the world. Does this play a part in the emergence of zoonotic diseases?
Viruses and all pathogens in general have co-evolved with their hosts, and a problem often occurs when a pathogen successfully infects a new host. That's when the new host, because it's susceptible to this, it's never encountered this pathogen before, can get quite sick. And because the population of those new hosts can be large, it can spread quickly from one to the other. So the combination of these factors, high biodiversity, so the areas that still have high biodiversity, which means then that the number of types of hosts increases, the types of pathogens that exist within these hosts increases. Okay, those are often in tropical areas of the world, which is where also you have some of the highest human densities. In addition to that, we also have really high densities of livestock or domestic animals in these areas. So in some sense, this creates the perfect condition. So you have a loss of natural habitats, which means that the potential for interaction between wildlife and domestic animals increases. And so the possibility of a pathogen spilling over from a wild host to a domestic animal increases. The domestic animals tend to act as amplifying hosts. And because we are in such close contact with these animals, the probability that a virus or a pathogen mutates and successfully infects humans also increases. So all of these factors come together and sort of create the perfect storm for a virus jumping over from its natural host to either a domestic animal or to a human. And because we've now created the perfect conditions for pathogens to quickly spread around the world, through global travel or through our globalized lifestyles, that's when then a pandemic hits.
Right. Now that you have said the word of this year, probably pandemic, I would like to talk about the COVID-19 pandemic a little bit and ask you, Beth, why do you think there has been so much talk about bats and viruses? Why are they so notorious? What about other types of hosts and pathogens?
Yeah, so the thing about bats is they're very diverse. So they make up about 20% of mammal species. So there's over 1,200 known species of bats worldwide, and they live in every kind of habitat and particularly overlap with people. So they've adapted really well to living in human dwellings or human construction. So they live right alongside us, really. And then the other thing that might play a factor in them passing a lot of infections onto other humans and animals is they've got really good immune systems. So part of the adaptation, because it's thought that part of the adaptation for flight is to have a really good immune system with really good inflammatory responses. So they sort of dampen down their inflammatory responses to viruses, so that they can still fly as well. So it's thought that it's kind of pre-adapted them to be able to house a lot of viruses within inside themselves without showing any clinical signs. So then they're living alongside humans, and within their dwellings they might be excreting and then sort of eating fruit, for example, and that gets contaminated with their saliva, and then those infections get passed on to both domestic livestock and to people. So another good example of that is the Nipah virus, which is circulated in Bangladesh, but also arrived in Kerala a couple of years ago, and was really stamped out very well by the authorities there. But that seems to be a situation where the fruit bats in the trees, for example, are kept quite close to the fruit bats are living in the trees where the pigs are kept on farms. And so the fruit bats were eating the fruit, getting contaminated with viruses in the saliva, and then the pigs would be eating that fruit and then passing the infection on to people. So it's that sort of chain that happens when you have people, livestock and wildlife all living together.
It seems to me from your explanation that bats have some kind of immune superpowers, like they have great inflammatory responses and stuff like that. So what about our domesticated animals, the animals that we farmed? They are also reservoirs of potentially zoonotic diseases. What can you tell about the use of antibiotics and the antibiotics resistance that has been emerging across the world, and how do these things affect the outcomes of zoonotic disease outbreaks?
The way we keep animals, it's related to the use of antibiotics is really related to the way we keep animals, the way we produce animal protein. Um, so if we looked at some of the traditional forms of animal rearing, often they were extensive in nature, with small flocks and large areas of movement. So plus there were also a lot of traditional methods of healthcare available for these livestock. Uh, but once we started producing animals on an industrial scale, this factory farming of animals, then our model of how these animals were produced changed. So we started breeding them to become bigger, faster. We started pumping them, full of very nutritious kind of food, so that they would increase in weight very quickly. Now there are trade-offs to developing these kinds of breeds. They have really poor immune systems. Um, Also, because of the conditions that they kept in, I mean, we really stocked them in very high densities. Any infection is likely to spread very quickly through the population. So this is why in most of these factory farms, animals are routinely fed with antibiotics. Antibiotics are also, of course, used as growth promoters. So these kinds of conditions, then what it does is it makes common pathogens, bacteria especially, resistant to most of these antibiotics. And this is when you can have these bacterial strains developing, or so when these multi-drug resistant bacteria uh, start coming out of these systems. That's when they can create real hazards for humans. Um, Recently, India banned the use of the drug colistin in poultry production. Now, colistin is a last resort drug. So if everything else fails to knock off a bacterial infection, then they would use a drug like colistin, and this was routinely being fed to chickens. So this kind of rampant misuse and abuse of antibiotics is something that really needs to be controlled.
Coming back to the pandemic as a current emergency, we've also been increasingly talking about another emergency, that is the climate change and global warming. In tropical countries like India and Southeast Asia, I'd say that diseases like malaria have been well known for long. But recently, there have been reports of malaria from the colder regions of the world, where earlier this disease was not prevalent. So we have had what we call range extensions of certain diseases. So is there a connection of zoonotic disease emergence and climate change? Beth, you could go first.
Vectors, so they might be, say, insects or ticks, and quite often their development rate through their sort of immature stages can be highly dependent on temperature, but also the availability of sort of aquatic water bodies as well, where they lay their eggs. For example, you can also have impacts of things like extreme events. So there's quite a lot of evidence, for example, in India, that diseases can be linked to flooding, like leptospira or anthrax. That can sometimes increase the rate of overlap between the pathogens and the humans or animals that transmit the disease. And there can often be sequences of drought, and flooding can also be favourable to diseases, because the drought sort of tends to concentrate people and animals and vectors down into the parts of the landscape where the water bodies are left, and then there can be flood events that then spread the transmission out from those areas. So there's quite a lot of evidence accumulating now of a role of climate change in increasing zoonotic disease transmission.
So another risk that climate change can potentially bring upon is there's also going to be a lot of people, and often the poorest and most vulnerable, who are going to be displaced. So they've been called climate refugees, and often they're gonna end up being worse off than they were before. They're going to have to be, put in makeshift areas, and whenever these kinds of things happen, then the risk of outbreaks of diseases, either whether they're waterborne or any of the other vector-borne diseases, increases in such conditions. And so hotspots of disease emergence can occur anywhere in the world, even if it's not directly linked to changing climate, but it's because of an indirect link where people are being forced to move out of areas that they were normally residing in. And the other risk that also occurs is that, for example, from Australia, where bat populations suffer from heat stress and are literally dropping out of the sky. And whenever animals are under stress, that's when their immune systems are also weaker. And this is when they can actually get sick from all those viruses that they are circulating within their bodies, and potentially this increases the chance of spillover of those viruses to other host animals.
I think that's a valid and an often overlooked aspect of disease occurrence, that usually the worst hit are the ones most severely stressed in the animal world and the poorest in the human world. So, how do we combat these occurrences? Can we try to prevent them altogether, or can we work towards dampening the blow when they do hit us?
Yeah, I think a really important thing is to try and understand a bit more what the diversity of pathogens are circulating in different wild animals that live close to people, for example. So been some sort of quite interesting projects trying to discover the viruses that even before the pandemic, they were trying to discover the viruses that bats harbour and see which ones can be transmitted to different livestock as well and to humans. So I think really understanding those sort of ecological interactions, the sort of network of interactions between pathogens and animals and humans is going to be really important. And then I think it's about sort of understanding also some of those ecological, environmental and social risk factors and sort of how they coincide in the landscape. That might be sort of less important for a sort of human to human transmitted disease like COVID, but for some of these other diseases we're talking about that are transmitted, say, through the environment, through water bodies or through vectors, it's really important for us to understand sort of what are those ecological and social risk factors. So, for example, where do those vulnerable kind of marginalized people that are using the ecosystem in different ways and getting exposed to the pathogens, sort of, you know, what determines how they use the landscapes and how do their livelihoods depend on that sort of landscape use, and then how does that link to where the wildlife and vectors are in the landscape?
You made a great point that it is not limited to just humans or just animals. There is a huge ecological, environmental, and social aspect to dealing with zoonotic diseases, which brings me to the concept of One Health. Abhi, can you just tell us what this concept of One Health?
The One Health concept or the One Health framework simply recognizes that human health is very closely interlinked with animal health and environmental health, and provides a framework that allows or that encourages people from different sectors to come together, to work together in an interdisciplinary manner, so that the societal challenges, especially health-related challenges, can be addressed by teams of people working together to find common solutions. Because we often find that human health is viewed uh, from a very biomedical perspective, where we try to understand the underlying cause of the ailment and treat it, but we often fail to put it in the context of the broader environment, where these kinds of, especially in the case of zoonoses, where they come from, what is the ecology of these of the pathogen itself, what is the ecology of its host or its vector, what is the complexity, what are the dynamics that this system um, occurs in a natural state, and what factors have led to the emergence of this pathogen into humans. Only by understanding the whole system are we then able to try and find effective ways of mitigating such emergence, or of trying to short circuit an important link in the transmission chain.
There is a division of zoonotic diseases in India. So they have been running some national level programs in order to address and mitigate certain zoonotic diseases, and especially rabies. So could you tell us a little bit more about that?
In general, the government of India has done historically a pretty good job in trying to control many of these diseases as and when they occur. A lacuna, though, has been the lack of a proper One Health approach, because most often what's happened is that even though the governments, even though the various ministries have over the last decade or so realized the importance of putting in place systems that promote One Health thinking, often these are within ministries. So it's often a guideline that says, oh yes, it's important for the health ministry to work with the animal husbandry department or the Ministry of Animal Husbandry, and farmers welfare and dairying and so on and so forth. But there has been no mechanism that's put in place with adequate funding, and with an overarching framework that will actually implement these on the ground. Okay, So that's where the sort of there's a slip in the implementation of this on the ground. So then people tend to continue to work in their silos. So, for example, something like rabies is still not a notifiable disease in humans in India. If a rabies patient is admitted to a hospital or a hospital notes that there is a case of rabies, it doesn't have to inform the center about it. Okay, and it does not go on record. So things like, for example, HIV or TB are notifiable diseases, and there is a chain of command. So every time a case is reported, is seen at a local hospital, it is then reported up to the center, which is why we actually don't have a good handle on the number of rabies cases reported in India. We're still using sort of these surveys to provide guesstimates of how many rabies cases are reported. So this is one of those examples where we need better coordination. We need a better mechanism so that bring in a proper One Health framework. So let me use rabies as an example itself to tell you how a better One Health mechanism can be implemented here. So we know that domestic dogs are the main host and reservoir for rabies. Yet we don't, until now, in fact, only now is a national action plan for rabies elimination being formulated, which is based on the One Health concept. And based on WHO guidelines, the plan is to vaccinate 70% of the domestic dog population to reduce incidences of rabies in humans. Now, this is, of course, easier said than done because it ignores the ecology of domestic dogs in India. And this is something that we've been working on for several years, and we find that there's not a single instance anywhere in India where demonstrably 70% of the domestic dog population has been vaccinated every year. Okay. The reason is because the efforts needed to vaccinate so many dogs reliably is just enormous, and we don't have the capacity to do so. So are there other ways we can do that? Are there other mechanisms that we can use to reduce the incidence of rabies in the canids, and then therefore break this transmission chain between canids and humans? Okay, so there is certainly a lack of a communication mechanism, which from the center, from the very top, that trickles all the way down to the very bottom. So this is what we need to enact for a proper One Health implementation. And this is something that I think Beth can elaborate more on what we've done in the KYASANUR forest disease, the monkey fever risk project, on how we've brought together partners from various agencies to bring a proper One Health framework into place, and how this has helped us to understand better the dynamics of KYASANUR forest disease.
Yeah, maybe it's useful to say a little bit about KYASANUR forest disease first. So it's a flavivirus, and it's transmitted by ticks. And ticks have different life stages, and at the different life stages they feed on different animals. So the disease gets into humans from the nymphal ticks. And so really you can see how immediately you need a One Health approach, really, because you have the sort of cattle involved that can feed the ticks, but also the monkeys and the small mammals, so bringing in the sort of wildlife aspects as well. And the disease used to be restricted to a few districts in Karnataka, but then over the last few years it's expanded to Kerala, to Goa, and to Maharashtra as well. So it's really sort of undergoing quite a dramatic spread at the moment. So we sort of pulled this One Health project together. So sort of some of the main features, I suppose, is that we wanted to try and work out which parts of the landscape human spillover was most likely to occur. So we studied the ecology. So we looked at where the wildlife and the livestock and the ticks were in the landscape. We also looked at how people were using the landscapes and where they might be most likely to get exposed to ticks. And I think this is really useful sort of facet of the One Health framework is that you could look at these trade-offs between the benefits that people get from ecosystems and the possible disbenefits from catching diseases while you're carrying out those activities. So that can be really useful. So we're really sort of studying this stuff at the field level, but a really important thing was to involve managers of the system across different sectors. So for example, from the environment sector, we had the forestry managers involved. We had from the animal health sector, the people involved in sort of looking at the cattle and recording monkey deaths and doing autopsies and things. And then from the human health sector, we had the people that are sort of responsible for managing KFD. And this was really important for sort of harnessing everyone's knowledge, but also understanding the sort of priorities of managers across those sectors. So whether they were interested in, we were trying to sort of generate these spatial risk maps of where the hotspots in the landscape for KFD occurred. So I think it's been really beneficial for us to understand the drivers of the emergence of KFD. So for example, we've shown that historically spillover has been most likely in parts of the landscape where the forest is being removed, say for paddy cultivation or for plantations and stuff. And we've shown that the people that are most at risk are the people that are using the forest, say, to graze their cattle or to work as day labourers in plantations, or even sort of housewives and children that live deeper in the forest. So it's really by sort of taking this holistic approach of this sort of the social risk factors and the ecological risk factors that we've sort of come to a better understanding of the system. And so hopefully this will be kind of useful going forward to improve the management of KFD, and the framework can probably be applied to sort of other zoonotic diseases that are tied to sort of use of forest ecosystems as well.
So the One Health framework, as it is currently being envisaged by, or as it is being practiced by many sectors of the government, including in the Standing Committee on Zoonosis or the Intersectoral Coordination Committee. So wildlife health is really missing. And that's a massive lacuna in India at the moment, that we don't do enough surveillance. We don't have enough capacity for doing surveillance. Our ecological surveillance or ecological monitoring mechanisms for animal health have really not been developed as well as they should have been. And I think it's high time we started doing this. We should not be dependent on just one or two nodal institutions to do all the research. Instead, we really need to be broad-based. I mean, we are a large country with more than 1.3 billion people. And so we need to have multiple centers all across India, which need to be doing One Health sentinel surveillance. And this is what we're really trying to propose to the government.
The importance of biodiversity can be overlooked in this conversation of zoonotic diseases with respect to human and animal health. As the last important point to be discussed, could you, Abhi, talk about how biodiversity is also a pillar in the concept of One Health?
If you think of pathogens, they're actually a component of biodiversity, holistically speaking. And there are several studies to show that biodiversity, though, the more diverse the system, the better its dampening effects on the risk of emergence of zoonotic pathogens. And when you start sort of reducing biodiversity, or when you start depleting populations of hosts, that's when the risks of pathogens emerging increases. Ecosystem services that we derive from diverse natural landscapes, and humans in particular, are intricately dependent on this across the world. Also, the people who tend to be often most disadvantaged or most vulnerable are those who work in, or whose livelihoods depend in, tropical forest areas or tropical forest landscapes. And they're also often the most susceptible to the risk of these emergencies. Um, Whereas in fact their livelihoods or their lifestyles themselves would have contributed very little to the risk. So it's often large scale, industrial scale conversion of landscapes. And so when looking at culprits, we need to understand that local people who are often dependent on these resources are also often the most vulnerable to these. Whereas it's large scale activities such as dam building or big coal mines, large hydropower projects that we are currently seeing so much of, that are often the culprit in terms of being the leading causes of biodiversity loss. And this is what we need to really be thinking about when we're trying to mitigate uh, the impacts of these projects on biodiversity.
Thing about those local communities that are the most affected, they're also sometimes the ones with the most knowledge of how to mitigate the diseases as well. Like they might be using traditional medicine interventions for those diseases, or the way they keep their animals, for example. They've sort of naturally adapted that to the risk of diseases. So in terms of, say, not mixing flocks if they know their animals are carrying diseases. So I think there's really a lot to be learned from those communities in terms of the ways we could potentially mitigate zoonotic diseases, as well as really trying to understand in advance what the consequences of any large scale development and land use changes are as well, with all the sectors involved. Yeah, I mean, there has been a lot of evidence really building lately from sort of analysing these ecological networks between different vertebrate animals and pathogens, that has shown that the animals that harbour the most viruses are those ones that humans have either spread around the world, so either sort of invasive alien species like rats or domestic cats and dogs, or it's the ones that are most adapted to living in human environments. So it's clear that sort of biological conservation is really important, in that if we do that properly and we sort of stop moving animals around in quite the way that we do at the moment, and sort of degrading natural habitats, then that should sort of hopefully decrease our risks of spillover events.
And this was a most enlightening session, and I'm sure our audiences also found it very enriching. I think if there is one, although we touched upon several important topics briefly, if there is one thing that the audiences can take home with them, is that ecological conservation and ecological health is very, very integral to human health and the health of the animals found by humans. And I thank you both very much for your time and for your expertise. And I look forward to the audience's feedback on this. Thank you so much.